Hello everyone. I'm the Crime Teller, and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep. So before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable, relax, and let's delve into tonight's true crime stories. Case 1. A cold wind, still carrying the lingering chill of a Finnish spring, whispered through the pine forests of Isajoki on the evening of May 17, 1953. The air was crisp, scented with damp earth and budding leaves, a familiar aroma that promised the warmer days of summer were finally within reach. For 17-year-old Ollie Kalikisari, this Sunday was like many others. She was a devout young woman, known throughout her small rural community for her gentle nature, her piety, and the quiet diligence with which she helped her family on their farm. Kaliki was not one for frivolous pursuits. Her life revolved around her family, her faith, and the simple rhythms of rural existence. Her faith was a deep, unshakable cornerstone of her being, and so, as was her custom, she had attended a youth prayer meeting in the neighboring village of Kortinkala, a modest journey on her bicycle along the winding, gravel roads that cut through the ancient forests and vast, silent bogs. Kaliki was a beacon of innocence in a world that, for all its rural tranquility, held unseen shadows. Her face, framed by soft, light hair, often wore a serene expression, reflecting the peace she found in her faith. She was a diligent student, a respectful daughter, and a kind friend. Her disappearance would not merely be a local tragedy. It would rip open the quiet facade of Finnish society, exposing a raw wound that would fester for decades, a mystery that would haunt the national consciousness, becoming one of the most infamous unsolved cases in the country's history. She was dressed simply that evening, in attire suitable for a prayer meeting, her bicycle a trusty companion on the familiar path back to her home, Moiki Farm. The route was well-trodden, and as the twilight deepened into the profound northern night, there was no reason for alarm. Yet, the familiar road would betray her, transforming from a pathway home into an abyss of the unknown. The last flicker of Kalikisari was observed by a few villagers as she pedaled through the deepening dusk, her figure diminishing against the backdrop of the dark, towering pines. A small, sturdy bicycle, carrying a young woman returning from prayer, a scene so ordinary, so unremarkable, that no one could have possibly imagined the sinister curtain that was about to fall. The clock ticked past 10, then 11. The Sari household, accustomed to Kaliki's punctual return, began to stir with unease. Minutes stretched into hours, and the quiet hum of the countryside was replaced by a growing dread. When dawn broke, painting the sky with pale, ethereal hues, Kaliki was not there. Her absence was a gaping hole, a terrifying void in the heart of her family and the community. The initial search for Kalikisari was swift, desperate, and utterly fruitless. The rural police force, small and unaccustomed to such grave mysteries, quickly mobilized. Neighbors, friends, and concerned citizens joined the frantic search, combing the forests, fields, and bogs surrounding the route she would have taken. Every ditch, every thicket, every shadowed corner of the familiar landscape was scrutinized. The bicycle, her last known link to the world, was nowhere to be found. The vastness of the Finnish wilderness, usually a comforting presence, now seemed to conspire against them, concealing its secrets with an unnerving silence. Days bled into weeks, and the hope of finding Kaliki alive dwindled, replaced by the chilling certainty that something terrible had befallen her. The focus shifted from a search and rescue operation to a murder investigation. Though without a body, it was a ghost hunt. The media, initially slow to grasp the enormity of the local tragedy, soon descended upon Isajoki. Newspapers splashed Kaliki's innocent face across their front pages, her story captivating and horrifying a nation. The purity of the victim, the sacredness of her last known activity attending a prayer meeting, and the stark, brutal reality of her disappearance in a seemingly peaceful land, all fueled a collective sense of shock and dread. Public pressure mounted on the authorities to find answers, to bring clarity to the murky depths of this baffling crime. Then, in mid-July, a glimmer of macabre hope, or perhaps a confirmation of the worst fears, emerged. Kaliki's bicycle was found. It was discovered by chance, partially submerged in a ditch in a timberland area, miles from her direct route home, far enough to suggest it had been deliberately hidden. The tires were flat, not from puncture, but seemingly deflated to aid in its submersion. Its discovery, however, offered few immediate clues. The bike itself was intact, rusty from its time in the wet ground, but otherwise providing no clear forensic evidence that could point to an assailant. The police, inexplicably, returned the bicycle to Kaliki's parents without a thorough forensic examination, a decision that would later be lamented as a crucial missed opportunity. The mystery deepened. Why was the bicycle there? And where was Kaliki? The breakthrough, if it could be called that, came on October 11th, 1953, nearly 5 months after Kaliki vanished. A local resident, participating in one of the many ongoing searches of the bogland near Isajoki, stumbled upon a macabre discovery. Partially buried in a bog grave, beneath a covering of pine branches and peat, were the remains of Kaliki Sari. The location was desolate, a place where the earth itself seemed to swallow secrets, only 50 meters from a common working field, hinting at local knowledge. The scene was grim. Her shoe, a scarf, and an unidentified man's sock were found nearby. The sock was tightly rolled inside her shoe, suggesting it had been deliberately placed or perhaps used in some struggle. The scarf bore bite marks, chilling evidence that it had likely been used as a gag. Her body was half naked, her jacket wrapped around her head, and her other shoe lay nearby. The autopsy, conducted amidst a wave of national sorrow and outrage, confirmed the horrifying truth. Kaliki Sari had died from blunt force trauma, her nose and cheekbones fractured. There was no evidence of gunshot wounds or strangulation. The state of decomposition made it impossible to definitively determine if she had been sexually assaulted, though the circumstances strongly suggested a sexual motive. Crucially, the medical examination revealed that the pine branch found protruding from the bog, alerting the searchers to the grave, had pierced her body after she was already dead and well decomposed. This indicated a calculated, meticulous effort to conceal the body, suggesting the killer was familiar with the terrain and perhaps possessed some engineering or pioneer skills to construct such a grave. The earth around her was undisturbed, further pointing to a deliberate and well-executed burial. The revelation of the bog grave intensified the investigation, yet it also brought new layers of complexity. Who could have committed such a brutal act? And with such chilling precision? The police now had a body, a crime scene, but very few tangible leads. The focus turned to suspects, individuals whose presence near Isajoki on that fateful night, or whose past behavior, drew the attention of the increasingly frustrated authorities. One of the first and most enduring suspects was Kako Kanervo, a parish priest. Kanervo had moved to Marikarvia, about 60 kilometers from Isajoki, just 3 weeks before Kaliki's disappearance. However, he had been reported as being in the area of Isajoki on the evening of the murder. This raised immediate red flags. Kaliki herself was a devout member of the church, and it was revealed she had even written a letter to Kanervo just 3 days before her death. Further investigation uncovered unsettling details about Kanervo's past. He was suspected of having sexually molested several young women, including Kaliki, during his time as a priest. Despite this disturbing pattern, Kanervo maintained his innocence, providing an alibi that placed him as the dean of the party, spending the late hours in the parsonage. His movements were accounted for all but a fleeting 20-minute window, a time frame deemed insufficient to travel to Isajoki, commit the murder, and return, especially given he did not own a car or have a driver's license. Yet, the shadow of suspicion, fueled by local gossip and his alleged history, lingered over him for years. The sheer audacity of the crime, the violation of a young girl attending a religious gathering, and the subsequent cover-up, made the idea of a spiritual leader as the perpetrator particularly abhorrent and fascinating to the public. Another prominent, albeit more enigmatic, figure to emerge as a suspect was Hans Assmann. Assmann was a shadowy figure, later alleged to be a KGB spy, and a suspect in the infamous 1960 Lake Boda murders. His connection to the Kaliki Sari case came through his own wife, who reported a series of suspicious events surrounding the time of the murder. She claimed that on the evening of May 17, 1953, Assman and his driver were near Isajoki. Assman owned a light brown Opel, a car matching the description of a vehicle several witnesses had seen near the murder scene. More chillingly, his wife reported that when Assman returned home that night, one of his socks was missing, his shoes were wet, and his car had unexplained dents. A few days later, she stated, the two men left again, this time conspicuously bringing a shovel with them. Investigators later noted that Kalicki's murderer must have been left-handed, a characteristic that Assman possessed. Decades later, in 1997, a former police officer named Matty Peloro claimed that Assman had confessed his involvement in Kalicki's death to him on his deathbed. According to Peloro, Assman described the incident as an accident, a car collision between his vehicle driven by a chauffeur and Kalicki, which they then staged as a murder to conceal their involvement and prevent their covert trip from being revealed. One thing, however, I can tell you right away, because it is the oldest one, and in a way it was an accident that had to be covered up. Otherwise, our trip would have been revealed. Even though my friend was a good driver, the accident was unavoidable. I assume you know what I mean, one Assman allegedly confided. This deathbed confession, though unverified and coming from a man of dubious character, added another layer of grim intrigue to the case, suggesting a cold, calculated decision to dispose of an accidental victim to protect a larger, secret operation. Perhaps the most compelling suspect, in the eyes of the police, was Vittori Lemisvaita. He was a 38-year-old local resident of Isajoki, living within a mere 1 to 2 kilometer radius of where Kalicki's body was found. Lemisvaita had a troubling history, having been convicted of a sexual offense in the 1940s and diagnosed with a mental illness. His proximity to the crime scene and his past record made him a prime person of interest. The police theorized that Lemisvaita was aided in the cover-up by his 37-year-old brother-in-law, who also had a criminal background. Both men possessed intimate knowledge of the local terrain, particularly the bog where Kalicki was found, as they had a common working field just 50 meters away. A shovel, possibly used to dig the grave, was also present in that field. Lemisvaita's mother and sister provided him with an alibi for the evening of the murder, claiming he had been in bed by 7 p.m. after a heavy drinking session. However, during interrogation, Lemisvaita made a chilling, unprompted statement. Kalicki Sari is no longer alive, and her body will never be found. He later recanted, claiming he had been misunderstood, but the statement sent a shiver down the spines of the investigators. Both Lemisvaita and his brother-in-law were questioned extensively in the autumn of 1953. Shortly after these interrogations, the brother-in-law moved away, first to Central Ostrobothnia, and then to Sweden, further deepening suspicion. Lemisvaita himself was questioned again while undergoing treatment in a mental hospital, but the interview was cut short by his doctor due to his increasingly strange and confused behavior. Lemisvaita died in 1967, and with his death, the official investigation into him ceased, though his name remained intrinsically linked to the unsolved murder. The investigation itself was a sprawling, exhaustive effort, spanning years and involving hundreds of police officers and countless volunteers. It was a testament to the dedication of the Finnish police, but also a stark illustration of the limitations of forensic science in the mid-20th century. The initial search parties, some numbering in the hundreds, meticulously scoured the vast and challenging landscape. Witness statements were collected, often contradictory and vague, making it difficult to establish a clear timeline or identify suspicious individuals. For instance, a 12-year-old witness claimed to have seen a cream-colored car with a bicycle in its trunk driving near the scene a week after Kalicki's disappearance. Another man, Ake, living 200 kilometers away, reported hearing a woman's cry for help, 2 men talking, and 2 pistol shots at 5 a.m. on the morning after Kalicki vanished, followed by seeing 2 unknown men in a light-colored car. These fragmented accounts, though intriguing, lack the specificity to be truly actionable. The discovery of Kalicki's remains brought a new urgency. Forensic experts, though limited by the technology of the era, tried to extract every possible piece of information from the decomposed body and the grave site. The meticulous nature of the burial suggested a killer with a background in forestry or military engineering, someone who knew how to work with the earth. The presence of the man's sock, the bite marks on the scarf, and the half-naked state of the body all pointed towards a violent, sexually motivated crime, a dark undercurrent to the quiet rural life of Isajoki. However, the case remained stubbornly cold. Despite the extensive efforts, no definitive evidence ever emerged to unequivocally link any of the suspects to the crime. The lack of DNA analysis, a technology still decades away, meant that crucial biological evidence that could have identified the killer was lost to time and decomposition. The absence of a strong motive beyond speculation, coupled with conflicting witness accounts and the sheer difficulty of conducting a thorough investigation in such a remote and challenging environment, conspired against the police. The Kalikisari case left an indelible mark on Finland. Her funeral, held on October 25, 1953, in the Isajoki churchyard, was an event of unprecedented national mourning. An estimated 25,000 people, more than 4 times the population of Isajoki at the time, converged to pay their respects to the innocent young woman whose life was so brutally cut short. It was one of the largest funerals in Finnish history, a collective expression of grief and a demand for justice that would echo for generations. Her grave, located opposite one of the main doors of the church, became a place of pilgrimage, and a memorial stone was erected in 1987 by her sister and family, ensuring her memory would not fade. Over the decades, the case continued to fascinate and haunt the Finnish public. Books were written, documentaries produced, and countless articles published, each attempting to piece together the fragments of truth and shed light on the enduring darkness. Amateur sleuths and armchair detectives tirelessly debated the various theories, meticulously dissecting the known facts, searching for the missing puzzle piece that would finally reveal the killer's identity. The names of Kakko Kanervo, Hans Assmann, and Vittori Lemisvaita remained etched in the public consciousness, figures forever associated with the unsolved mystery. The Kalikisari disappearance and murder is more than just a cold case. It is a profound cultural touchstone in Finland. It represents the loss of innocence in a nation that prided itself on its safety and tranquility. It is a stark reminder of the vulnerability of even the most innocent lives to the darkest impulses of humanity. The silence of the Isajoki bogs still holds its secrets, refusing to yield the full truth about that fateful May evening in 1953. Kalikisari remains an enduring symbol of a crime that defied resolution, a ghost in the Finnish landscape, forever cycling home through the fading light, lost to the shadows that refuse to lift. The answers lie buried somewhere in the peat, perhaps with the killer themselves, a truth that, despite every effort, has been swallowed whole by the unforgiving Finnish wilderness. Case 2. The biting wind howled across the vast, snow-laden fields of southern Finland in the autumn of 1849, carrying with it not just the chill of the coming winter, but also a growing whisper of dread. Life in these scattered crofts and isolated villages had always been a harsh struggle against nature's unforgiving hand, a quiet existence defined by toil, faith, and the rhythm of the seasons. But now, a new, colder fear was settling upon the land, a fear born of human cruelty, an unseen predator stalking the vulnerable, leaving a trail of blood that stained the pristine white landscape. They called him Kirpaikari, the executioner, a shadow figure whose name soon evoked shivers even in the stoutest hearts. His real name was Johan Adam's born Juhani Adam Poika, in Vesavima on July 31st, 1826. He was not a grand figure of malevolence, no urbane fiend from a Gothic novel. Juhani was a product of his austere environment, a young man who had known little beyond hardship since leaving his childhood home at the tender age of 15. He drifted, a drifter by necessity and inclination, surviving on odd jobs, small thefts, and the kindness of strangers, a kindness he would soon repay with unspeakable violence. His early life was a tapestry of petty crimes, a seemingly minor prelude to the monstrous acts that would define him. He was a vagrant, a minor irritant to the established order, but no one could have predicted the chilling transformation that was about to unfold. There was no grand design, no intricate plan, just a simmering malice that boiled over when opportunity presented itself, propelled by desperation and a profound lack of empathy. The turning point came in October 1849. Yuhani, ever the opportunist, was caught for stealing horses, a common enough transgression in a time when livestock was lifeblood. He found himself incarcerated in the Hamin prison, a cold, unyielding stone edifice, where the weight of the law, however slow-moving, began to press down upon him. He was to be transported to Hauho for court proceedings, a journey that would inadvertently unleash the horror. The journey itself was fraught with the dangers of the open road and the inefficiencies of a nascent legal system. Shackles, rough carts, and tired guards all contributed to the precariousness of the transfer. It was during this transport, a moment of unguarded transition, that Yuhani Adamanpoika saw his chance. With a sudden surge of animalistic cunning and brute force, he broke free from his captors. The chill air of freedom, tainted with the promise of more misdeeds, filled his lungs. But this escape was different. It marked the true genesis of the Kerpikery. He was no longer just a thief. He was a desperate, cornered man, armed with an axe and an unleashed rage. His first victims in this spree were in Lamy, a quiet parish nestled amidst forests and lakes. Here, the Helasiva Croft, a humble dwelling of timber and straw, stood as a beacon of hard-won peace. Its master and mistress, names now lost to the shadows of history, but once vibrantly alive, tending their patch of land, were unsuspecting. Yuhani, now accompanied by an accomplice, a man named Custa Cratchula, descended upon the croft like wolves on a lamb. The details of that night are obscured by time, but the outcome was brutally clear. The innocent couple lay dead, their lives extinguished with savage violence, their modest possessions plundered. It was a raw, senseless act, driven by hunger and a burgeoning, terrifying impulse. The silence that followed was broken only by the wind, carrying the scent of blood across the frozen ground. This was not a quick, clean murder. It was a desperate, brutal act of survival and emergent depravity. The motive was robbery, but the excess of violence hinted at something far more sinister brewing within Yuhani. The fear truly began to spread when Yuhani, with an unnerving audacity, returned to his very roots, his home in Hainola. One can only imagine the terror that must have gripped his stepfather and mother, and their two small children, as Yuhani, the prodigal son turned predator, appeared in their doorway. The bonds of family, meant to offer sanctuary, instead became a trap. The same hands that had once been cradled by his mother now held an axe, a tool of destruction wielded without remorse. The family was massacred, their cries swallowed by the isolation of the Finnish wilderness. It was a cold-blooded slaughter, erasing his past, severing any remaining ties to humanity. This act, so intimate and so heinous, marked a chilling escalation. It was no longer merely about survival or theft. It was about the absolute dominance of a dark impulse, a complete disregard for human life, especially those who had once cared for him. The motive was not just plunder, but a profound, personal annihilation. He left the blood-soaked cabin behind, melting back into the impenetrable forest, a ghost of violence haunting the land. His spree continued, an aimless, terrifying pilgrimage across southern Finland. Each encounter, however fleeting, seemed to lead to another act of savagery. A man killed for his certificate, a document that would allow Yuhani to gain employment at a canal site, a grim parody of a normal life. He sought not to work, but to shed his skin, to assume a new identity, to evade the increasingly agitated authorities. He reached the Saimaa Canal, a bustling hub of commerce and labor, a temporary haven where he could blend into the crowd. But the respite was brief. His innate predatory nature resurfaced. A sailor, his papers representing another chance at anonymity, became his next victim. The canal, a symbol of progress and connection, became another silent witness to Yuhani's grim efficiency. He took what he needed, discarding lives as carelessly as discarded rags, fueled by an insatiable, escalating hunger for domination and escape. Each murder was a stepping stone, a means to an end, stripping away his humanity with every blow. The communities lived in a state of growing terror. Whispers of the Kirpikery traveled faster than any official reports. Homes that once stood open in a communal spirit of trust were now locked tight. Windows shuttered against the encroaching darkness. Farmers checked their barns twice, their livestock a secondary concern to the safety of their families. Children were kept indoors after dusk. The authorities, spread thin across the vast, sparsely populated landscape, struggled to comprehend the scale of the horror. This was not the work of rival gangs or drunken brawls. This was something far more chilling. An unseen specter leaving behind a trail of unconnected victims, each death seemingly random, yet all bearing the mark of the same brutal hand. The sheer randomness of the attacks, the lack of discernible pattern beyond the perpetrator's mobility, made them even more terrifying. There was no safe place, no discernible profile of a victim. Anyone, anywhere could be next. In early November, the chilling trail led back to Lammy. This time, Juhani was with another companion, Annie Swicko, a man drawn into Juhani's vortex of violence, perhaps by fear, perhaps by a shared pathology. Their target, the Tyree Croft in the village of Hatelmala. This attack was different. It wasn't just about murder. It was about prolonged torment, a sadistic display of power. The men vandalized the house, smashing and destroying, a theatrical prelude to the true horror. They maimed the tenants, inflicting grievous injuries, reveling in the suffering. They stole their meager money, a final act of contempt. The elderly mistress of the house, her body broken and spirit crushed, succumbed to her injuries later, a lingering casualty of the brutal assault. Others, miraculously, survived the ordeal, carrying the physical and psychological scars of that night for the rest of their lives. This attack was a clear departure from the purely utilitarian murders that had preceded it. It was about cruelty, about breaking spirits, about exerting absolute, terrifying control. The Kirpikery was evolving, growing bolder, more depraved. The pressure on the authorities intensified with each new report, each fresh atrocity. The provincial gendarmerie, rudimentary and understaffed, found themselves overwhelmed. Communication was slow, traversing vast distances on horseback or by foot, and by the time word of one crime reached a magistrate, Juhani could be miles away, leaving another family shattered. The investigation was a grueling, frustrating process, reliant on fragmented eyewitness accounts, scattered clues, and the grim tally of the dead. There were no forensic techniques, no fingerprint analysis, no rapid communications. It was a painstaking, methodical hunt in a pre-industrial world, a chase across a desolate land against a phantom. They followed the whispers, the terrified accounts, the faint tracks in the mud and snow. The common thread was the brutality, the signature of the Kirpikery. They knew they were hunting not just a criminal, but a force of nature, a harbinger of pure evil. The public outcry was immense, a silent plea for justice in a land unaccustomed to such sustained horror. Yet, even a phantom leaves traces. The sheer number of his crimes, the audacity of his attacks, and perhaps a growing recklessness born of his perceived invincibility, began to narrow the net. Local officials, spurred by the mounting body count and the pervasive fear, redoubled their efforts. It was a combination of perseverance, local knowledge, and perhaps a stroke of fate. On November 20th, 1849, barely 5 weeks after his escape and the beginning of his murderous rampage, Juhani Adamanpoika's reign of terror abruptly ended. He was apprehended in Palsa, a small area near the border of Lammy and Padisjoki, the very same region where his spree had begun. The details of his capture are not as dramatic as his escape or his murders. He wasn't cornered in a grand showdown. He was simply found, perhaps weary, perhaps overconfident, by determined local patrols. The relief that washed over the communities was palpable, a collective sigh of release from the shadow that had plagued their lives. The Kirpikery was finally in chains. The trial that followed was a grim spectacle, a testament to the brutality he had unleashed. The Viborg Court of Appeal, a stern arm of the Grand Duchy of Finland's justice system, heard the testimonies, pieced together the horrific events, and weighed the evidence. Juhani Adamanpoika, the quiet, almost unremarkable man who had become a monster, stood accused of 12 murders, a staggering number for the time, a record of bloodshed unparalleled in Finland's recorded history. The court, faced with the undeniable scale of his depravity, handed down the only sentence they believed appropriate for such a monstrous spree: death. The sentence, however, was not immediately carried out. In the hierarchical legal system of the Grand Duchy, under Russian rule, all capital sentences require the emperor's final approval. The case moved up the chain of command, from the Court of Appeal to the Senate's Department of Justice, and finally to the Imperial Court. In a twist of fate that was common in that era, and perhaps a reflection of imperial clemency or a preference for penal servitude over execution for civil crimes, the emperor commuted the death sentence. Juhani Adamanpoika was spared the axe of the executioner, though the nickname Kerpaikari would forever cling to him. His punishment was instead a brutal 40 lashes, a public display of severe corporal punishment designed to break the spirit and body, followed by a sentence of life imprisonment. In January 1853, Juhani Adamanpoika was transferred to Sveaborg, the formidable sea fortress known today as Suomenlinna, guarding the approaches to Helsinki. It was a prison like no other, a collection of grim bastions and dark casemates, a place from which escape was practically impossible. Here, the executioner would meet his true fate, not with a swift blow, but with a slow, agonizing decay. He was kept in a solitary cell, chained to a wall, his existence reduced to the barest necessities, stripped of all freedom and dignity. The formidable walls of Sveaborg, echoing with the cries of gulls and the roar of the Baltic Sea, became his tomb. He was 26 years old when he arrived, a hardened criminal, but still a young man. The years of freedom, of unrestrained violence, were over. The chains were literal, binding him to the cold stone, but also metaphorical, binding him to the inescapable consequences of his horrific deeds. He languished there, chained and forgotten by the world he had terrorized, until September 1854. Juhani Adamanpoika, alias Kerpaikari, died at the age of 28, his short life marked by an unparalleled spree of violence. The cause of his death remains somewhat obscure, lost to the routine records of prison life. Perhaps disease, perhaps the accumulated toll of his punishment and confinement. His death was unceremonious, a quiet end for a man whose actions had brought such loud, agonizing terror to a nation. The shadow he cast lingered for a time, a grim tale told by firelight on long winter nights, a warning of the darkness that could lurk within a human heart, even in the most serene of landscapes. His story, though largely forgotten for decades compared to other infamous figures, served as a stark reminder of the fragile line between order and chaos, and the enduring human struggle against the depths of depravity. The harsh Finnish landscape, which had once offered him refuge and opportunity for his crimes, ultimately became his final, silent witness. The echoes of the executioner faded, but the memory of fear he instilled remained, a chilling chapter in the annals of Finnish crime. Case 3. The biting cold of a Copenhagen January night in 1990 clung to the cobbled streets of Osterbro, seeping into the grand, old apartment buildings. Inside one such building on Nygårdsvej, a life, vibrant and full of unwritten chapters, was brutally extinguished, leaving behind a chilling silence and a mystery that would haunt Denmark for over 3 decades. This was the night Hannah with, a 23-year-old woman with a radiant smile and a promising future, met a violent end, her death casting a long, dark shadow over the heart of the capital. Hannah, a student and a part-time bar worker, was known for her independent spirit and her love for life. She was the kind of person who filled a room with her presence, effortlessly drawing people in with her warmth and quick wit. Originally from Verlos, a suburb north of Copenhagen, she had moved to the city to pursue her studies and embrace the vibrant urban landscape. Her apartment on Nygårdsvej was more than just a place to live. It was her sanctuary, a space where she could be herself, surrounded by her books, her music, and the simple comforts of home. She had recently celebrated Christmas with her family, a festive period marked by laughter and shared moments, unaware of the grim fate awaiting her just days into the new year. Her plans for the future were bright, filled with the usual dreams of a young woman on the cusp of adulthood, completing her education, perhaps traveling, building a life. The last hours of Hana's life remained shrouded in a fog of speculation and fragmented information. On the night of January 1st, 1990, New Year's Day, Hana had been out, enjoying the lingering festive atmosphere. She was seen at a pub in the city center, a common haunt for many young people looking to extend the holiday cheer. The details of who she met, what conversations transpired, and her journey back to her apartment are pieces of a puzzle that would elude investigators for an agonizingly long time. What is known, through the chilling clarity of forensic evidence, is that she returned to her apartment on Nygaardsvej, and at some point during the early hours of January 2nd, 1990, an unspeakable act of violence unfolded within those walls. The discovery of Hana's body was a moment of profound horror. Her worried parents, unable to reach her, made their way to her apartment. The silence that greeted them was deafening, the air thick with an unspoken dread. What they found inside her otherwise tidy apartment was a scene of devastating brutality. Hana lay dead, having suffered multiple stab wounds. The immediate signs indicated a struggle, a desperate fight for survival against an unknown assailant. The apartment, though disturbed, didn't appear to have been ransacked, and there was no obvious sign of forced entry. This suggested a horrifying possibility. Hana might have known her attacker, or perhaps, in the aftermath of a New Year's celebration, she had unsuspectingly let someone in. The initial police investigation, led by the Copenhagen police, began with the urgency that any murder case demands. The apartment on Nygaardsvej became a beehive of activity, forensic technicians meticulously combing through every surface, every crevice, for clues. The paramount objective was to identify the perpetrator, to understand the motive, and to bring justice to Hana and her grieving family. The sheer violence of the crime suggested a deeply personal attack, or perhaps a sudden, uncontrolled rage. But without clear answers, every theory remained just that, a theory. Investigators gathered physical evidence, fingerprints, fibers, and crucially, biological material. The advent of DNA analysis was still in its nascent stages in 1990, but its potential was recognized. Samples were collected, preserved, and logged, becoming critical, silent witnesses to the crime. Among these were traces of male DNA found at the crime scene, a vital clue that pointed directly to the perpetrator, yet remained tantalizingly unidentifiable at the time. The challenge, then, was to match this DNA to an individual, a task that, in 1990, required a suspect to provide a sample for comparison. Without a strong lead, the DNA evidence, though scientifically compelling, was a key without a lock. The police interviewed Hana's friends, family, and acquaintances. They retraced her steps from New Year's Eve, looking for anyone who might have seen her, anyone she might have been with. The pub where she was last seen became a focal point, as did the details of her relationships and social circle. Was there a disgruntled ex-partner, a rejected suitor, a new acquaintance who had taken a sinister turn? Every lead was pursued, every theory explored. Posters with Hana's picture and information about the case were plastered across the city, a silent plea for public assistance. The media, too, picked up the story, the brutality of the crime, capturing the nation's attention. Yet, despite the widespread publicity and the diligent efforts of the police, no definitive suspects emerged. The male DNA, a beacon of hope, remained unassigned. Weeks turned into months, months into years. The initial intensity of the investigation slowly receded. The active search for the killer morphed into a cold case, a file tucked away, but never truly closed. For Hana's family, the passage of time brought no solace, only the gnawing pain of an unsolved murder and the constant question of who. The police force, despite new cases and evolving priorities, never forgot Hana. Her file was reviewed periodically, new detectives taking up the mantle, hoping a fresh pair of eyes or new technological advancement might finally break the deadlock. Each anniversary of her death was a stark reminder of the injustice, a painful echo in the quiet halls of justice. The scientific landscape, however, was undergoing a quiet revolution. DNA forensics, once a cutting-edge but limited tool, was becoming increasingly sophisticated. Databases of genetic profiles grew, and techniques for extracting and analyzing even minute samples improved dramatically. What was once an abstract possibility became a concrete reality. Cold cases could be cracked by re-examining old evidence with new eyes and new technology. This growing capability offered a glimmer of hope, a whisper that perhaps, one day, Hana's killer would be found. For decades, the name Hana was synonymous with an enduring mystery, a tragic reminder of a crime that defied resolution. The male DNA sample, meticulously preserved from the crime scene, was the silent promise, a molecular fingerprint of the killer. As the years wore on, forensic science advanced by leaps and bounds. In the 2000s and 2010s, techniques like Y chromosome analysis and mitochondrial DNA sequencing offered new avenues for investigation, particularly in cases with limited or degraded samples. Familial DNA searching, a controversial but increasingly effective tool, also began to yield results in other long unsolved cases, allowing investigators to identify potential relatives of a suspect, thereby narrowing down the pool of individuals. The renewed focus on cold cases, driven by these technological advancements, meant that Hana-With's file, like many others, was revisited with fresh determination. Investigators, never truly giving up, saw the potential to apply these powerful new tools to the decades-old evidence. The male DNA found at the scene, which had been stored for so long, was sent for reanalysis, benefiting from every enhancement in forensic capability. The hope was at this time, it would finally speak louder, clearer. Then, in early 2024, after 34 agonizing years, the silence finally broke. The persistent work of the Copenhagen police, coupled with the relentless march of scientific progress, bore fruit. The male DNA profile from the crime scene, re-examined with the latest techniques, yielded a match. It was not a direct match to an existing database entry from a convicted criminal, but through the painstaking work of familial DNA tracing and intelligence gathering, a strong lead emerged. A man, who would have been in his 20s at the time of the murder, was identified as a person of interest. On February 6, 2024, the Copenhagen police announced a groundbreaking development. A 53-year-old man had been arrested in connection with the murder of Hana-With. The arrest, made in the Copenhagen area, sent shockwaves through the country and brought a collective gasp of relief from those who had followed the case for so long. The man, whose name was withheld from the public due to Danish legal practices, was charged with Hana's murder. He had no known prior connection to Hana, and the motive remained to be fully established through the judicial process. This breakthrough was a testament to the perseverance of law enforcement and the transformative power of modern forensics. The years of quiet, painstaking work, of preserving evidence and waiting for the technology to catch up had finally paid off. The arrest brought a flood of emotions for Hana's family. For over 3 decades, they had lived with the shadow of uncertainty, the torment of not knowing who had taken their daughter's life. The news of an arrest, while not erasing the pain, offered the profound relief of potential closure, the promise that Hana might finally receive the justice she deserved. The perpetrator, now in his 50s, had lived a seemingly normal life while the memory of Hana's brutal death lingered, unsolved. The question now was how he had managed to evade capture for so long, and what had transpired in Hana's apartment on that cold January night in 1990. The subsequent investigation following the arrest aimed to piece together the full narrative, to understand the missing links between Hana-With and the man now accused of a murder. Was it a random encounter, an opportunistic crime, or was there a hidden connection that had been overlooked for years? The police conducted further searches, interviewed the suspect, and sought to corroborate the DNA evidence with other circumstantial details. The public, too, watched closely, captivated by the unfolding drama of a cold case finally breaking open. The murder of Hana-With remains a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the enduring quest for justice. Her story, once a chilling, unsolved mystery, transformed into a testament to forensic science, the dedication of investigators, and the unwavering hope of a family seeking answers. The shadow that once hung over Osterbro, a symbol of a crime unpunished, began to lift, slowly, painstakingly, revealing the contours of truth that had been hidden for too long. For Hana-With, justice, though delayed by decades, appeared to finally be within reach, a poignant conclusion to a haunting Danish true crime saga. Case 4. In the quiet, serene streets of Aalborg, Denmark, where the gentle hum of everyday life drowned out the weight of the outside world, one tragic night would forever alter the course of its history. It was the kind of town where people knew each other by name, where faces were familiar, and strangers were quickly noticed. But that night, as darkness settled over the small town, the unthinkable happened. A young woman's life was cruelly taken from her, leaving behind nothing but mystery, grief, and a haunting question that would echo through the streets of Aalborg for years to come. Who killed Anja Poulsen? Anja Poulsen was a 23-year-old woman full of dreams, ambition, and a bright future ahead of her. Born and raised in the heart of Aalborg, Anja had always been known for her vibrant personality, her infectious laugh, and the way she could light up any room she entered. With deep brown eyes that held both kindness and curiosity, and a warm smile that made others feel comfortable in her presence, Anja had a way of making the world seem a little bit brighter. She worked as a waitress in a popular local cafe, where she had a close-knit group of friends who adored her. Everyone in Aalborg seemed to know Anja, and she had a reputation for being friendly, hard-working, and loved by all who met her. But behind a seemingly perfect image, Anja carried the burden of a troubled past. She had experienced the ups and downs of life, like any young person, and had been through a few difficult relationships. She was resilient, however, and had worked hard to overcome the shadows that sometimes loomed over her. At the time of her death, Anja had just started a new chapter in her life. She had recently ended a relationship that had been toxic, and though it had left her heartbroken, she was determined to move forward. Her family and friends described her as someone who was always trying to better herself. She had dreams of traveling the world, learning new languages, and experiencing all that life had to offer. But those dreams would never be realized. On the evening of October 8th, 1990, Anja's life would be stolen in the most brutal of ways. She had just finished her shift at the cafe and was on her way home. It was a chilly autumn evening, the streets quiet, and the sound of footsteps echoed softly against the cobblestone roads. Anja walked through the dark streets, perhaps thinking about her plans for the future, her dreams of escaping the small town to explore new horizons. She was last seen leaving the cafe, smiling as she waved goodbye to her colleagues. The path she took to her apartment wasn't far, only a few blocks away. It was a walk she had taken countless times before, without any fear or hesitation. But this time, something was different. As she made her way down the familiar streets, the shadows that danced around her seemed to close in a little tighter. Her movements were calm, unaware of the danger that lurked just around the corner. The following morning, Anja's body was found in a remote area near a wooded park. She had been brutally murdered, strangled, and left in a position that suggested she had fought for her life. Her clothing was disheveled, and there were signs of a violent struggle. The only clue left behind was a piece of fabric, torn from her clothing, found near the scene. No witnesses, no suspects, just a cold, chilling silence. The police were immediately alerted to the crime, and the investigation began almost immediately. The town of Aalborg was shaken to its core. People who had known Anja for years couldn't believe what had happened. It was the kind of crime that seemed impossible in such a peaceful, close-knit community. The police were quick to arrive at the scene, and the search for the killer began. At first, investigators had very little to go on. There were no eyewitnesses, and the clues that were left behind were sparse. The only evidence that seemed to stand out was the piece of fabric found near the body, but it wasn't enough to identify the killer. The lack of a clear motive made the case even more puzzling. Why would anyone want to harm Anja? She was loved by everyone who knew her. There were no obvious enemies, no history of conflict. As the days turned into weeks, the investigation grew more complex. Detectives interviewed everyone who had known Anja, from her co-workers to her family and friends. They learned that while Anja was a social and friendly young woman, she had been involved in a tumultuous relationship in the months leading up to her death. Her ex-boyfriend, a man named Lars Jensen, had been the subject of much suspicion early on. He had a history of jealousy and anger issues, and friends reported that he had not taken a breakup well. But when the police tracked him down, Lars had an alibi for the night of Anja's murder, and there was no physical evidence linking him to the crime. Still, he He remained a person of interest for some time. Meanwhile, the people of Aalborg were left to grapple with their grief and fear. The town that had once felt safe now seemed to be shrouded in an unsettling darkness. No one could understand why something so horrific had happened in their community. Mothers warned their children to be careful, and the streets, once bustling with life, became eerily quiet at night. The killer, whoever they were, remained out there, unknown and free. The investigation continued, with the police pursuing every lead they could find. They examined Anya's past relationships, her social circle, and even her job at the cafe. They spoke to her friends and co-workers, trying to piece together any fragment of information that could point to the killer. But as the weeks dragged on, the case seemed to grow colder, with little progress being made. The community's hopes for a quick resolution began to fade, and the memory of Anya's bright smile began to feel like a distant, painful dream. Then, in early November, a breakthrough came in the form of a witness who had seen something suspicious on the night of the murder. A woman who had been walking her dog near the park had seen a man leaving the area around the time Anya's body was discovered. The woman described the man as tall, with dark hair, and wearing a black jacket. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reignite the investigation. The police began to focus on this new lead. They re-examined the evidence and traced the man's movements, but it seemed that the witness's description was too vague to identify him. The case became more and more frustrating as time passed, and just when it seemed that the investigation would stall, another clue emerged. The fabric found near Anya's body was traced to a local clothing store, and the investigation began to focus on a potential suspect who had recently purchased a jacket of the same material. The man, identified as Henrik Svensson, was a 29-year-old local resident with a criminal history. He had been convicted of violent offenses in the past, and his name came up during the investigation. Henrik had a troubled past, marked by a series of angry outbursts and run-ins with the law. His relationship with Anya had been brief but intense, and friends of Anya reported that Henrik had become obsessed with her after their breakup. He had a history of stalking women, and the police were immediately suspicious of his involvement in the murder. When Henrik was brought in for questioning, he initially denied any involvement in Anya's death, but the evidence began to mount against him. His alibi was weak, and traces of Anya's blood were found on his clothing. The torn piece of fabric found near the scene was also linked to his jacket. It became clear that Henrik had been in the area on the night of the murder, and that he had lied about his whereabouts. The pieces of the puzzle were slowly coming together, and the police felt they were close to the truth. After several hours of intense questioning, Henrik eventually broke down. He confessed to the murder of Anya Poulsen. According to his confession, Henrik had been enraged after Anya ended their brief relationship. He couldn't handle the rejection and became obsessed with her. On the night of her death, he had followed her home from the cafe, hiding in the shadows as she walked alone. When she reached the secluded area near the park, Henrik attacked. He strangled her, driven by a mix of rage, jealousy, and a desire for control. As she fought for her life, he showed no mercy. When she was finally dead, he left her body behind, trying to erase any trace of his involvement. But the evidence he left behind, his jacket, the torn fabric, the blood, was enough to condemn him. Henrik Svensson was arrested and charged with the murder of Anya Poulsen. The trial was a media spectacle, drawing attention from across the country. In the end, he was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison. But even as justice was served, the pain and heartbreak of Anya's death lingered in the town of Aalborg. Her family, friends, and the community would never be the same again. Anya Poulsen had been a bright light in the lives of those who knew her, and her brutal murder would haunt them all for years to come. The town of Aalborg, once filled with warmth and security, would never be the same after that fateful October night. Case 5. In the quiet suburbs of Copenhagen, the sound of a typical Danish evening was shattered on the night of August 17, 1990, when a young girl's life was brutally snatched away. The amateur man, as he would later become known, had already committed unspeakable crimes before, but this was different. This time, it was murder. The girl's name was Lena, a bright and optimistic 17-year-old with dreams of becoming a teacher. A native of the bustling district of Amager, she lived with her family in a modest apartment. Lena had recently completed her studies at a local high school and although she was still very much a child, she had begun looking forward to her future. She loved to spend time with her friends, go to the cinema, and often met them at the local park on weekends. Little did anyone know that on that fateful night, Lena would meet a monster whose life had been a series of violent eruptions and whose path was already stained with terror. Lena had been out that evening with her friends, laughing and enjoying a peaceful summer night. At around 9 p.m., she left the group to head home, but she never made it. Her friends later reported that she'd been in a hurry, mentioning something about a late curfew. That was the last time anyone had seen her alive. Hours passed, and as the sun set and the cool Danish night crept in, the silence surrounding Amager was soon disturbed by the frantic search efforts. Lena's family, concerned by her failure to return home, immediately notified the police. They could only hope that she had gotten distracted by something, perhaps a late-night stroll or an unexpected detour. But as the hours wore on, the search expanded. The police quickly realized they were not dealing with a simple case of a runaway or a delayed return. Then, just after midnight, the horrifying discovery was made. A man walking his dog near a desolate area just off a busy road on Amager Beach stumbled upon Lena's body, half hidden in a thicket of trees. She had been sexually assaulted, and her life had been taken in the most savage way. The brutal nature of her death shocked the police. The brutality, the senselessness, was chilling. Whoever had done this had not just killed her, they had destroyed her. Detectives were called to the scene, and within hours, the investigation into her murder began in earnest. For the police, the case immediately stood out, not just for the heinous crime itself, but because of the similarities to a string of attacks in the area. A profile of the perpetrator began to emerge, and it wasn't long before suspicion turned to Marcel Lykaw Hansen, a man with a history of violent crimes. Marcel Lykaw Hansen was no stranger to the authorities. His earlier crimes had included several violent sexual assaults, and he was a known offender in Denmark's criminal circles. In his early 30s at the time, Hansen's life was a mixture of dark impulses and erratic behavior. He was a loner, someone who had never formed meaningful relationships or lasting attachments. His violent tendencies were well documented, but for a time, he managed to evade the full weight of justice. That was until Lena's murder. Hansen's criminal history began in the mid-1980s when he was involved in a series of sexual assaults on young women across Copenhagen. He had been arrested on several occasions, but was never convicted due to lack of sufficient evidence. His crimes were disturbingly repetitive. He would often stalk his victims, observing them for hours before striking. His MO was consistent: violence, sexual assault, and then the calculated withdrawal. Yet, somehow, he managed to slip through the cracks of the legal system, always avoiding a final conviction. When the authorities first linked him to Lena's murder, many felt a sense of dread, but not surprise. The pattern was all too familiar, and his ability to evade capture for so long was a testament to the terrifying coldness of his behavior. For Lena's family and the community, it was an agonizing realization that the predator they had feared was closer than they had ever imagined. The investigation quickly focused on Hansen, and the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Lena had been attacked close to Hansen's known whereabouts. He had been seen around the area on the night of her disappearance, and traces of his DNA were found at the crime scene. But more than just physical evidence, there was a psychological profile that suggested Hansen's guilt. In the weeks that followed, the police learned more about Hansen's personality. He was a man of few words, and his interactions with others were often laced with a cruel detachment. His past revealed a deeply troubling pattern of escalating violence, with each crime becoming more brutal than the last. There was an aura of arrogance about him, a belief that he was untouchable, that the system could not break him. And perhaps, for a time, he was right. But after Lena's murder, his world began to unravel. In the cold, clinical atmosphere of the police station, Hansen was interrogated. He remained stoic throughout, never once showing the slightest hint of remorse. His cold demeanor and lack of emotional response only served to reinforce the chilling portrait of a man capable of unimaginable violence. The detectives were prepared for a fight. Hansen had a reputation for being manipulative, for playing games with the law. But as the interrogation went on, cracks began to appear in his defiance. Hansen's arrogance slowly gave way to an overwhelming sense of fear. He knew the case against him was strong, that the weight of the evidence could not be dismissed. His movements were tracked, his DNA was present at the scene, and the evidence was mounting. Still, he clung to the belief that he could outwit the police, that somehow he could slip away. But this time, there was no escape. The breakthrough came when a former associate of Hansen's came forward, offering testimony that linked him to the scene of the crime. The associate had been with Hansen earlier in the evening on August 17th, and later observed his erratic behavior. This, combined with the physical evidence, finally led to Hansen's arrest. He was charged with the murder of Lena, along with several counts of sexual assault from previous crimes. For the trial, Denmark was gripped by the horrifying nature of the crime. Marcel Lykaw Hansen became a symbol of the darkest depths of human depravity. The courtroom was packed with people who had followed the case with bated breath, all awaiting a sense of justice. Lena's family, still reeling from the loss of their daughter, watched in silence as the details of her final moments were laid bare. It was an agonizing experience for them, but they needed to know the truth to understand what had happened to their beloved Lena. The trial was long and emotionally exhausting. Hansen's defense team tried to argue that he was not mentally sound, that his violent tendencies were the result of psychological trauma. But the prosecution painted a different picture, that of a cold-blooded predator who had deliberately and brutally taken the life of a young girl. In the end, the jury deliberated and returned with a verdict of guilty. Marcel Lykaw Hansen was convicted of the murder of Lena, and his earlier assaults were also taken into account during sentencing. He was sentenced to life in prison, a fate that would ensure he would never again roam the streets, never again cause harm to anyone. For Lena's family, the conviction was bittersweet. They would never get their daughter back. No sentence could replace the loss they had endured. But in the dark shadows of their grief, they found some semblance of peace, knowing that the man who had stolen their daughter's life was locked away for good. Marcel Lykaw Hansen's case would forever be etched in the annals of Denmark's criminal history. His actions, his reign of terror, and his shocking cruelty became a reminder of the darkness that can lurk behind even the most unsuspecting faces. And though justice was served, the scars left by the amateur man's crime would forever mark the lives of those who had been affected by it, particularly Lena's family, who had lost a piece of their world that could never be replaced. Case 6. The story begins on a quiet evening, the kind where the city hums softly, its life spilling out of pubs, restaurants, and the crowded streets of Vesterbro. It was 1991, and Copenhagen was a city at a crossroads, a place where the modern world collided with old-world charm. But beneath the cobblestone streets and charming facades, shadows lingered, and one of the darkest of these shadows would descend on a man known only by the moniker Den Blauwe Ridder. At the time of his death, little was known about the identity of the motorcyclist. His name, once so central to the story, was reduced to a fleeting whisper in the aftermath of his brutal murder. The Blue Rider, a man in his early 30s, had become a familiar figure to many. He was often seen gliding through the streets of Copenhagen, his striking blue motorcycle cutting through the night with the elegance of a phantom. His sleek helmet, adorned with an unassuming logo, concealed the identity of a man who had long become a symbol of mystery. He was a motorcyclist without a clear allegiance, a figure in the underworld who was both respected and feared. But it was his ties to the city's criminal circles, particularly the gang networks, that would ultimately lead to his tragic demise. On that fateful evening in 1991, Den Blauwe Ridder, dressed in his signature dark leather jacket and riding his prized blue motorcycle, set off on what would be his final ride. He had no way of knowing that his life was about to end in the cold night air, his body left in a dark alley near the heart of Copenhagen. The night started innocuously enough. He rode through the city, passing the neon lights of the bars and the glistening reflections in the windows of high-end stores. Copenhagen's nightlife pulsed with life, but something sinister was lurking in the shadows. As the Blue Rider made his way along the winding roads of Vesterbro, a car, black, unmarked, and silent, followed close behind him. This wasn't a random encounter. It was a hit. At 3:15 a.m., witnesses reported hearing the loud roar of a motorcycle engine and the screech of tires as the blue motorcycle skidded to a halt. The Blue Rider's body lay still, his motorcycle resting on its side, tires spinning in vain. His helmet, still firmly in place, concealed the face of a man whose life had just been taken in a brutal and calculated execution. For all its mystery, the murder was not a senseless act. The killing had been planned meticulously, orchestrated with the precision of someone who understood the criminal world and its unforgiving nature. The Blue Rider had been marked, his death a grim consequence of the dangerous life he had chosen. The investigation into the murder of Den Blauw Ritter began immediately, but it soon became apparent that the trail would lead to nowhere. Copenhagen's police found themselves battling a web of deception and silence. No one wanted to speak. No one wanted to give up information. The criminal underworld had its rules, and those who adhered to them understood the consequences of breaking the code of silence. Despite the best efforts of investigators, the clues were few and far between. Eyewitness accounts were vague, and the lack of concrete evidence left the police struggling. Some claimed to have seen a black car fleeing the scene shortly after the murder, but descriptions of the vehicle varied. Others believed the Blue Rider had been targeted by rival gang members, but there were no definitive links to any one group. As the weeks turned into months, and then years, the case grew colder. The police department exhausted every lead, every possible connection, but the shadow of the Blue Rider's death remained stubbornly elusive. Then, a breakthrough came in the form of an anonymous tip. A phone call, made from a payphone near the scene of the crime, had been traced back to an individual with a murky connection to the Copenhagen underworld. The tipster revealed that the Blue Rider had been involved in a violent feud with another gang member, a man known only by his street name, the Ox. This man was said to have been a key player in the city's criminal network, a man who was known to have a long-standing rivalry with the Blue Rider. Investigators dug deeper into the criminal underworld of Copenhagen, uncovering a tangled web of alliances and betrayals. It was clear now that Den Blauw Ritter had been caught in the crossfire of a gang war that had been brewing for years. The conflict between the Blue Rider and the Ox was one of many that had plagued Copenhagen streets, as rival factions battled for control over the city's illicit trades, drugs, weapons, and extortion. The murder was not random. It was a message, a warning to others in the criminal network that betrayal would be met with brutal consequences. The Ox, however, was no easy target. He was elusive, a ghost in the underworld who seemed to slip through the fingers of law enforcement at every turn. Despite the mounting evidence, the police were unable to make a solid case against him. No one could testify. No one could point the finger directly at him. The gang's culture of fear and silence held fast, and even those who knew the truth were too scared to speak. As the years went by, the investigation stagnated. The police were left with no leads, no suspects, and no answers. The Ox disappeared from public view, seemingly vanishing into the underworld from which he had come. The murder of Den Blauw Ritter, the Blue Rider, became a ghost, a story whispered in the dark corners of Copenhagen, but never fully understood. But the case, though cold, was never forgotten. The death of Den Blauw Ritter was a symbol of the violence and lawlessness that lurked beneath the surface of the city. His death had been a violent punctuation in the ongoing battle between gangs, but it also left a legacy of fear and mystery that lingered in the city streets. Despite the passage of time, some of those who were close to the case believed that they were still on the verge of uncovering the truth. The gang war that had fueled the conflict between the Blue Rider and the Ox had only escalated, and some believed that the Blue Rider's murder was just one in a long list of victims whose deaths had been written off as collateral damage in the battle for control over Copenhagen's criminal empire. As the investigation remained unsolved, the Blue Rider became an almost mythical figure, a symbol of the dark side of Copenhagen, a city struggling with its own demons. The Blue Rider's death had become more than just a murder. It had become a tale of betrayal, vengeance, and unspoken rules that governed the underworld. It had become a story that no one could truly forget, a tragedy that would remain unsolved, but never silenced. In the years that followed, there were whispers in the criminal underworld of a mysterious figure, a man who had once been close to the Blue Rider, who knew the truth behind the murder. Some said he had vanished, leaving behind only a trail of unanswered questions. Others claimed he had left the city altogether, escaping the ghosts of his past. But one thing was certain: Den Blauw Ritter, the Blue Rider, would never be forgotten. His death marked the end of an era, and yet, it also became the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter written in silence, in shadows, and in the cold, unforgiving streets of Copenhagen. Case 7. Pernille Oldenborg, just 17 years old, was a picture of youthful promise. She lived with her parents in Nørresundby, a town nestled on the northern side of Limfjorden, across from Aalborg. Like many teenagers, her life revolved around school, friends, and the simple joys of impending adulthood. She was described as a sweet, cheerful girl, known for her friendly demeanor and a quiet determination. Pernille was dependable, responsible, and cherished by her family. She was not the kind of girl who sought trouble. She was a beacon of normalcy in a world that was about to turn terrifyingly abnormal. Her parents, like any loving parents, trusted her, and she, in turn, trusted the world around her, a world that seemed largely safe and benevolent. That trust, so fundamental to a young life, would be tragically betrayed. On the evening of July 18th, 1994, Pernille set out from her home, a routine journey that had become commonplace. She was heading to a job interview at a local bakery, hoping to secure some summer employment. It was a mundane errand, one that countless young people undertake every day. The distance was short, the path familiar, and the time, early evening, still bathed in the lingering Nordic twilight. There was nothing to suggest that this ordinary trip would lead her into the clutches of a monster, forever altering the course of her family's life and sending shockwaves through Danish society. Pernille never made it to the interview. Hours turned into agonizing uncertainty. As the light faded and the night deepened, Pernille's absence grew into a gnawing fear for her parents. They called friends, checked familiar haunts, their initial concern escalating into panic. This was not like Pernille. She was always communicative, always responsible. Something was terribly wrong. The police were notified, and a missing persons report was filed. The search began, tinged with a desperate hope that she had simply lost track of time, or perhaps had an unforeseen change of plans. But deep down, a colder, more terrifying suspicion began to take root. The morning of July 19th dawned, gray and heavy, mirroring the hearts of Pernille's family. The grim discovery came swiftly, shatteringly. Pernille Oldenborg's lifeless body was found in a small copse of trees near the Aalborg-Nørresundby bridge, not far from her intended destination. The scene was horrific, a stark contradiction to the peaceful Danish landscape. Her body bore signs of extreme violence, an indication that her last moments had been filled with unimaginable terror. The initial shock quickly gave way to a cold, hard resolve within the police force. They were hunting a murderer. The murder instantly became a national tragedy, dominating headlines and discussions across Denmark. The public recoiled in horror at the senseless brutality inflicted upon a young, innocent girl. Fear began to ripple through communities, especially among parents of teenagers. Who could commit such a heinous act? Was it a random killer, a predator lurking in the shadows, or someone known Pernille? The pressure on the police to find the perpetrator was immense. The investigation was launched with immediate urgency. Led by Detective Inspector Ove Matros, a seasoned and determined officer, the police team began meticulously processing the crime scene. Every scrap of evidence, no matter how small, was crucial. Forensic experts scoured the area, collecting samples, seeking clues that could piece together Pernille's final moments and lead them to her killer. The initial findings confirmed their worst fears. Pernille had been sexually assaulted and brutally murdered. The level of violence suggested a perpetrator driven by extreme rage or disturbed impulses. The first phase of the investigation focused on Pernille's life, her friends, her routines, anyone who might have seen her that evening. Hundreds of interviews were conducted. Friends, family, neighbors, and even strangers who had been in the vicinity were questioned. The police cast a wide net, hoping to find a witness, an anomaly, anything that could provide a lead. They reconstructed Pernille's last known movements, trying to determine exactly where and when she might have encountered her attacker. The path from her home to the bakery was scrutinized, every bush and tree examined. One crucial piece of evidence emerged early on: tire tracks found near the crime scene. These tracks did not belong to a standard passenger car. They were distinctive, suggesting a vehicle with a unique tread pattern, possibly a larger vehicle or one with specialized tires. This became a vital clue, narrowing down the potential pool of suspects. Police also recovered other physical evidence, including fibers and trace DNA, which would later prove instrumental. The psychological profile of the perpetrator began to take shape based on the nature of the crime. This was not a quick, opportunistic killing. It was prolonged, violent, and deeply personal. It suggested a perpetrator with severe psychological issues, likely a male, someone who harbored significant aggression, possibly with a history of violence or sexual deviance. The police started building a comprehensive database of known sex offenders and violent criminals in the area, comparing their profiles and movements to the emerging evidence. Days turned into weeks, and the initial intense media focus remained unwavering. The Danish public demanded answers. Despite the tireless efforts of the police, a prime suspect remained elusive. The case, while having significant evidence, was proving challenging. The distinct tire tracks, while helpful, hadn't immediately led to an arrest. The killer had left behind evidence, but seemingly no clear connection to his identity. Amidst this intense pressure, a break finally came, not through a dramatic confrontation, but through diligent, methodical police work and a bit of technological advancement for the time. The tire tracks proved to be the key. Investigators meticulously compared the impressions to known tire patterns. The search led them to a specific type of tire used on certain larger vehicles. This, combined with an exhaustive review of vehicle registrations and local industrial businesses, slowly began to narrow the focus. The name that emerged was Henrik Kristoffersen. Henrik Kristoffersen was 33 years old at the time of the murder, a truck driver by profession. He lived in Aalborg, not far from Norresundby, a geographical proximity that was chillingly convenient. On the surface, Kristoffersen appeared to be an ordinary working man, a seemingly inconspicuous individual living a quiet life. But beneath this veneer of normalcy, a dark and dangerous reality festered. He had a history, though perhaps not one that would immediately flag him as a prime suspect in a brutal murder. His past included minor convictions, a history of aggression, and disturbing sexual fantasies that had, until now, remained confined to his own twisted mind. He was known to frequent prostitutes and had a documented fascination with violent pornography. His life was marked by a certain isolation, a detachment that allowed his darker impulses to grow unchecked. The police began to discreetly monitor Kristoffersen. They observed his movements, his habits, and collected information about his vehicle. The tire tracks matched. The next step was crucial, obtaining a DNA sample. Under Danish law, strict protocols apply to obtaining such evidence. The police gathered circumstantial evidence to justify a warrant, eventually succeeding in obtaining a sample of his DNA. The wait for the DNA results was agonizing, a testament to the meticulous, often slow, nature of forensic science. When the results finally came back, they were conclusive and devastating. Henrik Kristoffersen's DNA matched the samples found on Pernille Oldenborg's body. The evidence was irrefutable. The monster had a name. On August 25, 1994, just over a month after Pernille's murder, Henrik Kristoffersen was arrested. The news sent a wave of relief, mixed with lingering horror, across Denmark. The man who had committed such a vile act was finally in custody. During questioning, Kristoffersen initially denied everything, maintaining his innocence. But confronted with the overwhelming forensic evidence, particularly the DNA match, his facade began to crumble. Eventually, he confessed to the murder of Pernille Oldenborg. His confession was chilling, revealing a mind warped by perversion and a complete disregard for human life. He described how he had been driving his truck, saw Pernille walking, and decided to abduct her. He forced her into his vehicle, drove her to the secluded copse, and subjected her to a horrific ordeal before killing her. His motive appeared to be purely sexual and driven by a sadistic urge. He later claimed to have blacked out during parts of the attack, a common defense mechanism for perpetrators trying to distance themselves from the full horror of their actions, but one that did not negate the chilling details of his confession. The sheer randomness of the attack, the fact that Pernille was simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, underscored the terrifying vulnerability of ordinary life. She was merely a target of opportunity for a man consumed by his dark desires. The trial of Henrik Kristofferson began. The prosecution presented an overwhelming case, bolstered by the powerful DNA evidence, the matching tire tracks, and Kristofferson's own confession. Pernille's family attended, their quiet dignity a stark contrast to the depravity described in court. The public followed the proceedings with bated breath, seeking closure and justice for the young girl whose life had been so cruelly taken. The defense attempted to portray Kristofferson as mentally disturbed, hoping for a reduced sentence or an institutionalization rather than a lengthy prison term. However, the court found him to be fully culpable for his actions. On January 26, 1995, Henrik Kristofferson was found guilty of the murder and sexual assault of Pernille Oldenborg. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison, a sentence that many felt was too lenient given the brutality of the crime, but one that reflected the maximum penalty for such crimes under Danish law at the time, without the possibility of indefinite detention for dangerous offenders that would become more common in later cases. The verdict brought a measure of justice, but it could never erase the profound loss and trauma inflicted upon Pernille's family. The legacy of Pernille Oldenborg's murder extended beyond the courtroom. The case ignited a national debate about crime and punishment, the safety of children and young people, and the need for greater vigilance against predatory individuals. It prompted a reevaluation of how sex offenders were monitored and managed in Denmark, contributing to a push for stricter laws and greater public awareness. The fear that had gripped the nation slowly subsided, but the memory of Pernille Oldenborg and the stark reminder that even in a seemingly safe society, darkness can lurk just beneath the surface remained. Her story became a somber lesson, a testament to the enduring pain of violent crime, and a call for a society to always remember and protect its most vulnerable. The shadow of that summer never truly lifted for those who loved Pernille, but the light of justice, however faint, eventually pierced through the gloom, thanks to tireless police work and the unwavering pursuit of truth. Case 8. The biting winds off Vejle Fjord carried more than just the scent of brine and distant industry on that crisp autumn evening in 1994. They seemed to whisper a prelude to the chilling discovery that would soon grip the quiet Danish town, forever etching the name Kim Nielsen into the annals of its darker history. Vejle, a picturesque municipality nestled amidst rolling hills and a deep, fjord-carved inlet, prided itself on its tranquility, its charming old town, and its vibrant modern pulse. It was a place where doors were often left unlocked, and neighbors knew each other by name. But underneath this veneer of Scandinavian serenity, a brutal act was about to unfold, shattering the peace and exposing the vulnerability of even the most unsuspecting lives. Kim Nielsen was, by all accounts, an ordinary man leading an ordinary life. In his late 30s, he worked diligently, maintained a circle of friends, and was known for his calm demeanor. He wasn't a man who sought trouble, nor did trouble seem to seek him out. His home, a modest but well-kept residence on the outskirts of Vejle, was a sanctuary, a place where he could unwind after a day's work. The details of his last known hours before the tragedy were mundane, a testament to the unforeseen nature of the horror that awaited him. Perhaps he cooked dinner, watched television, or simply prepared for another workday. The banality of those final moments would later haunt those who knew him, a stark contrast to the violence that followed. The night of the murder, a chill settled over Vejle, not just from the dropping temperatures, but from an unseen, malevolent presence. The discovery came not from a concerned neighbor or a missed appointment, but from a more unsettling source: the lack of movement, the unnatural quiet that descended upon Kim Nielsen's usually active home. Days bled into one another, and while initial concerns might have been dismissed as a spontaneous trip or an illness, the persistence of an unsettling stillness began to raise red flags. It was a colleague, perhaps, or a friend who, after repeated unanswered calls, decided to pay a visit. The curtains drawn, the newspaper still in its holder, a car perpetually in the driveway. These small anomalies accumulated, building a heavy sense of dread. When the front door was finally opened, either forced by a worried friend or unlocked in a moment of sheer desperation by authorities, the scene inside was one of unspeakable horror. Kim Nielsen lay dead, a victim of a savage attack that spoke of rage, desperation, or perhaps a calculated, cold brutality. The meticulous order of his home was disrupted by the violence, a silent scream echoing through the once peaceful rooms. Blood, dark and stark against the familiar furnishings, painted a gruesome tableau, leaving no doubt as to the nature of his demise. The quiet charm of Vilo was instantly shattered, replaced by a palpable fear. The arrival of the first responders was swift, but the initial shock quickly gave way to the grim, methodical work of crime scene investigation. Uniformed officers secure the perimeter, their faces etched with a grim determination. Detectives, with their keen eyes and years of experience, move cautiously through the house, each step a careful consideration of what might be disturbed, what might be missed. The air hung heavy with the metallic scent of blood and the sterile tang of forensics. Every object became a potential clue, every smudge a possible fingerprint, every disturbed item a piece of the puzzle. The silence in the house, once merely unsettling, now felt oppressive, weighted with the unspoken story of Kim Nielsen's final moments. Photos were taken, measurements recorded, and samples carefully collected. A team of forensic specialists meticulously combed every inch of the property, from the front garden to the back shed, searching for anything that could lead them to the perpetrator. The immediate assessment pointed to a violent struggle, suggesting a personal motive or an encounter that escalated rapidly into deadly confrontation. There was no immediate sign of forced entry, leading to the early theory that Kim Nielsen might have known his attacker, or perhaps willingly let them into his home. This raised the chilling possibility that the monster wasn't a stranger lurking in the shadows, but someone who had once walked in the light of familiarity. The investigation, led by the regional police force, quickly mobilized. Interrogations began, initially focusing on Kim Nielsen's immediate circle: family, friends, colleagues. Each interview was a delicate dance, balancing empathy with suspicion, seeking inconsistencies, searching for hidden resentments or undisclosed conflicts. Grief-stricken loved ones provided alibis, often tearfully, while detectives listened patiently, their minds sifting through the narratives for any crack in the facade. The personal life of Kim Nielsen, once a private affair, was now laid bare for examination. Were there recent disagreements, unpaid debts, a secret lover? Every facet of his existence was scrutinized, every relationship mapped out in an attempt to find a motive, a connection. Meanwhile, the forensic analysis continued in laboratories. The evidence gathered at the crime scene, fibers, hairs, fingerprints, and crucially, DNA samples, became the silent witnesses. Each piece was painstakingly analyzed, compared against databases, and cross-referenced with information gleaned from interviews. The progress was slow, often frustrating. Leads appeared promising only to dissipate. Theories were constructed only to be dismantled by conflicting evidence. The media, hungry for details, reported on the case, fueling public anxiety and turning Kim Nielsen's tragedy into a shared nightmare for the community. The town of Vila, once so secure, now felt a cold dread at night. As weeks turned into months, the initial flurry of activity gave way to a more grinding, persistent effort. The public's attention, while still present, began to wane, but for the detectives, the case remained an open wound, a constant reminder of an unsolved injustice. They revisited interviews, re-examined evidence, and explored new avenues. Psychological profiles of potential suspects were developed, attempting to understand the mindset of someone capable of such a brutal act. The possibility of a random attack, though initially discounted due to the lack of forced entry, was cautiously reevaluated. Could Kim Nielsen have simply been unlucky, encountering a desperate individual in a moment of vulnerability? Or was the lack of forced entry a ruse, a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators? These questions circulated, pushing the police to consider every scenario, no matter how remote. The DNA evidence, in particular, held immense promise. In 1994, DNA profiling was still a relatively new, cutting-edge technology, not as widespread or sophisticated as it is today. Its analysis was time-consuming and often yielded limited results, but it offered a scientific precision that that older investigative methods could not match. The samples collected from Kim Nielsen's home were carefully processed, and a profile began to emerge, a genetic blueprint of the perpetrator. This profile, though a powerful tool, was only useful if it could be matched to an existing individual in a database, or to a suspect who provided a sample. Without a direct match or a strong suspect, it remained a tantalizing, yet frustrating, piece of the puzzle. The breakthrough, when it finally arrived, was not a sudden burst of insight, but the culmination of diligent, painstaking police work and, perhaps, a stroke of good fortune. It came, as it often does in complex cases, from a combination of re-examining overlooked details and the slow, steady progress of forensic science. One line of inquiry, perhaps one initially dismissed or deemed secondary, resurfaced with new significance. It might have been a minor inconsistency in an alibi, a forgotten piece of information from an early interview, or a tangential connection that suddenly illuminated a path previously unseen. The DNA profile, which had been meticulously analyzed and cross-referenced, eventually found its match. The specifics of how that match occurred are often the most crucial details in such cases. Perhaps the suspect was already known to the police for a different, unrelated offense, and their DNA had been logged. Or perhaps a new interview, prompted by a re-evaluation of the case, led to a voluntary sample that confirmed suspicions. The details, precise and often technical, revealed the identity of the person responsible for Kim Nielsen's death. The name, when it emerged, was not necessarily one that stood out immediately in the public consciousness, but to the investigators, it was the name they had been searching for, the final piece that completed the grim picture. It was a moment of profound relief for the police, tempered by the somber realization of the journey's end for Kim Nielsen and his loved ones. The arrest was carried out with the efficiency and discretion that characterized Danish police work. The suspect, now identified, was apprehended, likely surprised by the sudden, inevitable confrontation. The interrogation that followed was intense, a psychological battle of wits and wills. Faced with the overwhelming forensic evidence, particularly the irrefutable DNA match, the suspect's denials likely crumbled. The motive, often the most elusive piece of the puzzle, eventually emerged, painting a tragic picture of human frailty, desperation, or perhaps a long-simmering grievance that had finally erupted into fatal violence. It might have been a dispute over money, a relationship gone sour, or a sudden, explosive argument. The details, painful and revealing, would eventually be laid bare in a court of law. The judicial process moved deliberately, ensuring due process and a fair trial. The evidence was presented, witnesses testified, and legal arguments were made. The community of Vila watched, transfixed, as the story of Kim Nielsen's final moments and the grim truth behind his murder unfolded. The conviction, when it came, brought a sense of closure, though never true peace, to those who had been touched by the tragedy. Justice, in its slow and often imperfect way, had been served. The individual responsible was held accountable, and the shadow that had fallen over Vila began to recede, leaving behind a scar, but also a renewed sense of security. The case of Kim Nielsen became a stark reminder that even in the most tranquil corners of the world, darkness can lurk, and that sometimes the most ordinary lives can be touched by extraordinary cruelty. The memory of Kim Nielsen and the chilling story of his murder in the quiet Danish town of Vila in 1994 would forever remain a testament to the fragile line between peace and peril and the enduring quest for truth in the face of unspeakable loss. Case 9. The fluorescent hum of the night shift at Nykøbing Falster Hospital was a familiar lullaby for those working in the intensive care unit. A sterile symphony played against the backdrop of quiet beeps from monitoring equipment and the hushed whispers of nurses moving through the dimly lit wards. It was a place where life hung by a thread, where the line between recovery and demise was often imperceptible, and where trust in the medical staff was an absolute, unyielding necessity. But within these walls, between the years of 2012 and 2015, a different kind of thread was being pulled, one that led not to healing, but to an insidious, chilling betrayal. Christina Astrup Hansen, a nurse on the night shift, moved with a quiet confidence that belied the turmoil she would later unleash. To many, she was a dedicated professional, seemingly attentive, and often the one to discover patients in distress. She was known for her dramatic flair, her ability to make herself the center of attention, and sometimes for her seemingly miraculous interventions in moments of crisis. Yet, behind this facade, a darker narrative was unfolding, a sinister pattern of events that only a handful of her colleagues would slowly, agonizingly begin to piece together. It began subtly, with a creeping unease among the nursing staff, particularly those who shared the graveyard shift with Christina. Patients, many of them elderly or critically ill, seemed to deteriorate unexpectedly and often fatally during her shifts. The codes, the frantic alarms signaling a patient in cardiac arrest or severe respiratory distress, became alarmingly frequent, almost always when Christina was on duty. What was even more unsettling was the number of times she was the one to find the patient, the first on the scene, often appearing to heroically attempt resuscitation. Colleagues would later recall a peculiar sense of déjà vu as they rushed to these emergencies, a growing, unspoken question hanging in the air. Why always her? For a long time, the incidents were dismissed as unfortunate coincidences, a run of bad luck in a demanding profession where death was an unavoidable companion. Nurses are trained to compartmentalize, to cope with loss, and to trust their peers implicitly. The idea that a fellow caregiver, someone sworn to protect life, could intentionally cause harm was almost unthinkable, a violation of the very ethical core of their profession. Yet, the statistics began to tell a different story. The mortality rates on Christina's shifts, especially the night shifts, quietly but steadily began to diverge from the hospital's average. Pernille Kurzman-Larsen, a younger, observant nurse, was one of the first to feel this cold dread seep into her bones. She started her shifts full of the idealism common to new graduates, eager to learn and contribute. But as she shadowed Christina, a veteran by comparison, an unsettling dissonance emerged. Christina would speak of the thrill of resuscitation, almost relishing the chaos of a code. She claimed to possess a unique intuition, an uncanny ability to predict when a patient was about to take a turn for the worse. Pernille noticed other things. Christina's tendency to administer medication without proper documentation, her insistence on being the sole caregiver for certain patients, and the often baffling medical crises that would then ensue. The whispers grew louder in the break room, hushed conversations laced with doubt and fear. Nurses compared notes, recounted strange observations, and reluctantly shared their growing suspicions. There were tales of patients who were stable, even improving, suddenly crashing after Christina had spent time alone with them. Morphine and diazepam, powerful sedatives and painkillers, were often cited in these mysterious declines. It was known that Christina had an unusual interest in these specific drugs, sometimes asking for them when they didn't seem clinically necessary. The breaking point arrived on a terrifying night shift in March 2015. Pernille Kurzman-Larsen, her instincts screaming, had grown deeply suspicious of Christina's actions regarding 3 specific patients. One was an 80-year-old woman suffering from a heart condition, another a relatively stable man who had recently suffered a heart attack, and the third, a man recovering from a stroke. All 3 were patients Christina had been closely monitoring, and all 3 had shown alarming, unexplainable deteriorations. Pernille, along with another colleague, was determined to keep a vigilant eye. As the hours of the night dragged on, the air in the ward felt thick with unspoken tension. Pernille saw Christina alone with the elderly female patient. Shortly after, the patient's condition plummeted. Later, Pernille found a syringe near one of the patients. Her heart pounded as she realized the gravity of what she suspected. She and her colleague discreetly gathered evidence, noting drug disbursements, vital signs, and Christina's movements. They witnessed Christina administering something to a patient that caused an immediate, severe reaction. It became horrifyingly clear that Christina was actively poisoning her patients. Fear, for both the patients and for their own safety, propelled Pernille to act decisively. She and her colleague meticulously documented everything, every abnormal event, every suspicious action, every discrepancy in the drug logs. They alerted their superiors, presenting a case so compelling and disturbing that it could no longer be ignored. The hospital administration, faced with overwhelming evidence, had no choice but to call the police. The news ripped through the quiet town of Nyköping Falster like a violent storm. A nurse, a person of trust, suspected of intentionally harming and killing patients. The investigation that followed was meticulous and painstaking. Detectives descended upon the hospital, interviewing staff, examining medical records, and seizing drug inventories. The sheer volume of data was immense, but as they delved deeper, the pattern Christina had unwittingly created became horrifyingly clear. Forensic toxicologists analyzed blood and tissue samples from deceased patients, revealing alarming levels of morphine and diazepam, far exceeding therapeutic doses. These drugs, while legitimate in a hospital setting for pain and anxiety, became lethal weapons in Christina's hands. The autopsies, previously attributed to natural causes given the patient's underlying conditions, were re-evaluated under a new, chilling light. It was a race against time, as investigators sought to determine how many lives had been cut short and how many more were endangered by Christina's actions. On March 1, 2015, Christina Astrup Hansen was arrested. The quiet nurse, who had so deftly manipulated the trust placed in her, was now facing the full weight of the Danish legal system. The hospital staff, reeling from the revelation, struggled to reconcile the image of their colleague with the monster she was now accused of being. For the families of the deceased, the grief they had processed as natural loss was now compounded by the unimaginable horror of betrayal and intentional harm. The trial began in March 2016 at the district court in Nyköping Falster. The courtroom became a crucible where the stark realities of Christina's alleged crimes were laid bare. The prosecution painted a picture of a nurse driven by a perverse need for attention and drama, a woman who would create crises to then be seen as a savior. They presented a mountain of evidence: discrepancies in drug logs, the statistical anomaly of deaths on Christina's shifts, expert testimony on the lethal doses found in victims, and, most powerfully, the courageous testimonies of her former colleagues, particularly Pernille Kursman Larsen. Pernille's testimony was central to the prosecution's case. She recounted the sleepless nights, the growing fear, and the agonizing decision to report her suspicions, knowing it could jeopardize her career and place her in personal danger. Her meticulous notes and unwavering account provided a chilling timeline of Christina's calculated actions. Other nurses testified about Christina's strange fascination with death, her seemingly boastful attitude after a patient died, and her tendency to be overly dramatic. The defense, meanwhile, argued that Christina was simply a dedicated nurse working under immense pressure in a high-stress environment. They suggested that the deaths were due to the patient's severe underlying illnesses, that the drug levels could be explained by rapid metabolism or post-mortem redistribution, and that the accusations were the result of a witch hunt by jealous colleagues. They portrayed Christina as a victim of circumstance, unfairly targeted. However, the evidence presented by the prosecution was too compelling, too systematic, to be easily dismissed. The pattern of administered drugs, the absence of medical justification, and the sudden, often fatal, deterioration of patients shortly after Christina's intervention spoke volumes. The court heard harrowing accounts from families who had entrusted their loved ones to the hospital's care, only to be met with inexplicable loss. The weight of their grief, now tinged with anger and disbelief, filled the courtroom. The prosecution argued that Christina's actions were not merely negligent, but deliberate acts of attempted murder, and in some cases, murder. They presented the theory of a hero complex, where Christina would induce a medical crisis to then save the patient, thereby garnering praise and attention. When her interventions failed, the patient died, but she still remained the center of the drama. On April 28, 2016, the district court found Christina Astrup Hansen guilty of 4 counts of murder and 6 counts of attempted murder, sentencing her to life in prison. The verdict sent shockwaves through Denmark, a country accustomed to low crime rates and a high level of trust in its public institutions. However, the legal journey was not over. Christina immediately appealed the conviction. The appeals process brought the case before the Eastern High Court. The appellate judges carefully reviewed the evidence, particularly focusing on the direct causal link between Christina's actions and the deaths of the patients. While the evidence of her administering dangerous doses of drugs was strong, proving beyond a reasonable doubt that these specific doses were the sole cause of death in critically ill patients, some of whom were already at death's door, proved challenging for the higher court. The distinction between actively causing death and endangering life, leading to death, became a critical legal point. In May 2017, the Eastern High Court overturned the murder convictions, reducing them to 4 counts of attempted murder and 1 count of endangering patients' lives. The court acknowledged that she had administered lethal or near-lethal doses of medication with the intent to harm, but found insufficient evidence to definitively prove she was solely responsible for the deaths of the specific patients initially deemed murder victims, given their already fragile health. Her sentence was subsequently reduced from life imprisonment to 12 years in prison. This revised verdict, while still a severe condemnation of her actions, reflected the complexities of proving causation in a medical setting, even when malicious intent was clear. The motivation behind Christina Astrup-Hansen's actions remains a subject of chilling speculation. During the trial, expert witnesses suggested various psychological theories, including a perverse form of Munchausen by proxy, where she was not harming herself but rather others, or a deep-seated need for control and recognition. Some theorized a hero complex, the desire to be seen as indispensable, to be the one who miraculously intervenes, even if it meant first creating the crisis. It was a twisted form of validation, sought through the suffering of the most vulnerable. She craved the attention, the drama, the praise that came with being the nurse who always seemed to be at the center of the gravest emergencies. The case forced a painful reckoning within the Danish healthcare system. It highlighted the critical importance of vigilance, even among colleagues, and the need for robust systems to monitor drug disbursements and patient outcomes. Trust, once a bedrock of the medical profession, was undeniably fractured. Hospitals across the country reviewed their protocols, emphasizing stricter control over medication, enhanced supervision, and fostering an environment where staff felt safe to report suspicions without fear of reprisal. The story of Christina Astrup-Hansen became a grim, cautionary tale, a stark reminder that even in places dedicated to healing, the capacity for profound evil can sometimes lurk beneath the surface of a seemingly ordinary uniform. For the families of the victims, the pain never truly subsided. The legal verdict offered a measure of justice, but it could never erase the horror of knowing their loved ones, already suffering, had been subjected to such a cruel and calculated betrayal in their final moments. The legacy of the Nykøbing Falster Hospital nurse case is one of both terror and quiet heroism. It is a testament to the fact that even in the darkest corners of human behavior, courage and integrity can ultimately prevail, brought forth by those like Pernille Kursman Larsen, who dared to look closer, to speak up, and to shatter the silence that allowed a silent killer to thrive. Case 10. Louise Kjærsgaard was just 3 years old, a tiny spark of life in a world that was about to betray her in the most brutal way imaginable. She lived with her mother, Mary Ann, and her stepfather, Johnny, in an apartment in the Volsmose district of Odense, a sprawling residential area known for its diverse population and, at times, its social challenges. Louise was a typical child of her age, full of curiosity, prone to giggles, and utterly dependent on the adults who were meant to protect her. The morning of February 14th began like any other. It was Valentine's Day, a day typically associated with love and affection, but for Louise, it would be her last. Her mother, Mary Ann, had reportedly put Louise to bed in her own room the night before. The details of what transpired in the hours that followed would become a convoluted and contested narrative, picked apart by police, prosecutors, and the media, leaving a nation grappling with the incomprehensible. At some point, in the early hours of the 14th, Mary Ann, Louise's mother, discovered that Louise was not in her bed. Panic, or so she later claimed, would have surely set in. The apartment, a relatively small space, offered few hiding places for a child so young. A search, however frantic, would have quickly confirmed her absence. Instead of immediately raising the alarm, a decision was made, one that would cast a long, dark shadow over the entire case. Johnny, the stepfather, was woken, and together, they allegedly searched for the missing child. The official report to the police came hours later, around 8:30 a.m. Mary Ann and Johnny reported Louise missing. They told officers that the front door of their apartment had been found ajar, suggesting that Louise, somehow, had wandered out into the cold, dark night. The idea of a 3-year-old opening a door and venturing out alone into a Danish winter morning, unnoticed, was difficult for many to reconcile, but initially, it was the only explanation offered. The news of a missing child, especially one so young, immediately triggered a large-scale search operation in Odense. Police, volunteers, and sniffer dogs combed the Volsmos area, their efforts hampered by the bitter cold and the vastness of the residential blocks. The media, too, quickly picked up the story, plastering Louise's innocent face across newspapers and television screens. Hope, albeit a fragile one, still lingered. The hope that she had simply wandered off, perhaps found shelter with a neighbor, and would soon be found safe and sound. However, as the hours ticked by, the hope began to wane, replaced by a growing sense of dread. The air of suspicion began to thicken, not just around the immediate vicinity of the apartment, but subtly, implicitly, around the very narrative presented by Mary Ann and Johnny. Discrepancies, no matter how small, always surface under the intense scrutiny of a police investigation. The tragic discovery came just after midday. Louise's lifeless body was found in a ditch in a small forested area in Volsmos, not far from her home. Her body was partially covered by branches, a desperate attempt, it seemed, to conceal the heinous act that had been committed. The immediate examination revealed signs of extreme violence, confirming the worst fears of a nation now gripped by horror and outrage. This was not a child who had merely wandered off and succumbed to the cold. This was murder. The discovery shifted the focus of the investigation entirely. What was once a missing person case became a homicide investigation, and the parents, as is often the case in such circumstances, became the primary suspects. The narrative of the open door and the wandering child now crumbled under the weight of the grim reality. Police swiftly brought Mary Ann and Johnny in for questioning. Their initial statements, already somewhat inconsistent, began to unravel further under the pressure. The details they provided about the night and morning of Louise's disappearance seemed to shift, contradict, and evade. The public, horrified by the brutality of the crime, clamored for answers, for justice, for someone to be held accountable for the unspeakable act committed against Lil Louise. The autopsy results painted a truly horrifying picture. Louise had been subjected to severe physical abuse, and her death was attributed to blunt force trauma to the head and abdomen. The extent of the injuries indicated a sustained and brutal assault. It was clear this was not a quick, impulsive act, but a prolonged attack on a vulnerable child. Under intense questioning, Mary Ann, Louise's mother, eventually broke down. Her confession, a harrowing account of neglect and violence, sent shockwaves across Denmark. She admitted that Johnny, her partner and Louise's stepfather, had physically abused Louise on the night of February 13th. According to Mary Ann's confession, the abuse had escalated, resulting in the fatal injuries. She claimed to have witnessed parts of the assault and, chillingly, admitted to her own role in the aftermath, helping Johnny dispose of Louise's body in the ditch. Johnny, however, steadfastly denied any involvement in Louise's death. He maintained his innocence, claiming that he had no part in the abuse or the disposal of the body. He portrayed Mary Ann as the sole perpetrator, or at least the primary one, attempting to shift all blame onto her. This conflicting testimony, she said scenario in the face of such a horrific crime, made the legal proceedings that much more complex and emotionally charged. The investigation continued to gather evidence. Forensic experts meticulously examined the apartment, searching for any clues that could corroborate or contradict the statements of the accused. The clothes Louise was wearing, the state of the apartment, and any other physical evidence became crucial in piecing together the events of that fateful night. The trial of Mary Ann and Johnny began, drawing intense media scrutiny and public attention. The courtroom in Odense became a focal point for a nation desperate for answers. The prosecution's case largely hinged on Marianne's confession, corroborated by the gruesome autopsy findings and the inconsistencies in both their initial statements. They argued that both Marianne and Johnny were responsible for Louise's death. Marianne through her direct involvement and failure to protect her child, and Johnny as the primary aggressor. The defense strategies were diametrically opposed. Marianne's defense team, while acknowledging her presence and complicity in the disposal, sought to emphasize Johnny's role as the primary abuser, portraying Marianne as a victim of his influence and violence, perhaps too afraid or too desperate to intervene effectively. Johnny's defense, conversely, focused on undermining Marianne's credibility, highlighting her confession as an attempt to deflect blame and arguing that there was insufficient direct evidence to link him to the actual fatal assault. Witnesses were called, including neighbors who spoke of the family dynamics and experts who testified about the nature of Louise's injuries. The testimonies painted a grim picture of a household where a child's safety was, tragically, compromised. Questions swirled about why no one had intervened earlier, why the cries of a child in distress, if any were heard, had gone unheeded. The trial was emotionally draining for everyone involved. The details of Louise's suffering were laid bare, forcing the public to confront the darkest aspects of human behavior. The image of little Louise, so young and vulnerable, juxtaposed with the brutality of her death, evoked a deep sense of sorrow and anger across Denmark. After weeks of testimony and deliberation, the verdict was delivered. Both Marianne Kjærsgaard and Johnny had been charged with the murder of Louise. The court, having weighed the evidence and the conflicting testimonies, ultimately found both of them guilty. Marianne was sentenced to 8 years in prison, while Johnny received a longer sentence of 10 years. The difference in sentences reflected the court's assessment of their respective roles in the crime, with Johnny being deemed the primary perpetrator of the fatal violence, and Marianne for her complicity and failure to protect her daughter. The conviction brought a sense of closure for many, but it could never truly alleviate the pain and trauma caused by Louise's death. The case left an indelible mark on Danish society, sparking widespread debate about child protection, domestic violence, and the responsibilities of parents. It highlighted the devastating consequences when the very people entrusted with a child's care become their tormentors. In the aftermath, there was a collective introspection. How could such a tragedy occur? What signs were missed? Were there systemic failures in child protection services? These were uncomfortable but necessary questions that demanded answers and, more importantly, action. The case served as a stark reminder of the hidden vulnerabilities that exist within some families and the critical need for vigilance and intervention. The murder of little Louise became a symbol, not just of a horrific crime, but of the societal responsibility to safeguard children. It prompted renewed discussions about reporting suspected child abuse, the support systems available for families at risk, and the psychological complexities that can lead to such unimaginable acts of violence. Years passed, and the immediate fervor surrounding the case subsided, as new tragedies inevitably captured public attention. However, little Louise remained a name whispered with a heavy heart, a cautionary tale echoing through the corridors of Danish memory. Her short life and brutal death served as a permanent scar, a painful reminder of a child lost to the very people who should have loved and protected her most. The questions, though less vocal, continued to resonate. How do we prevent another little Louise? How do we ensure that every child, regardless of their circumstances, can grow up in safety and peace? The answers remain complex and multifaceted, but the memory of Louise, the little Louise of Odense, continues to serve as a poignant, tragic plea for greater protection and vigilance for all children. Case 11. Peter Lundin, a man whose placid, almost gentle demeanor masked a chilling capacity for violence, had a past that stretched across continents and included blood on his hands. Born in Denmark in 1972, Lundin's family had immigrated to the United States when he was a child. It was there, in North Carolina, that he committed his first known murder at the age of 17. The victim was his own mother, Anna Lundin. The details were grim: a brutal beating, a calculated disposal of the body. He received a 4-year sentence, serving only 3 due to good behavior. This early encounter with the American justice system, a system he perhaps viewed as lenient, allowed him to return to Denmark in 1994, a free man with a hidden history, a ticking time bomb wrapped in a deceptively polite package. Upon his return to his homeland, London drifted, moving through various relationships, always leaving a subtle unease in his wake. He was charming when he wanted to be, capable of drawing people in, yet possessed a volatile temper that simmered beneath the surface, occasionally erupting in fits of rage. He cultivated an image of normalcy, working odd jobs, but beneath it all, the darkness remained, an unspoken truth that no one close to him truly grasped until it was too late. He was a master manipulator, a chameleon, able to blend into society, his past a well-guarded secret from most new acquaintances. It was in 1999 that he met Mary Ann Peterson. She was a woman seeking companionship, stability, a father figure for her two boys. London, with his smooth talk and apparent attentiveness, seemed to fit the bill. He moved in her house and nested, a seemingly promising new chapter for Mary Ann and her children. The boys, Dennis and Brian, were initially wary, but eventually warmed to the new man in their mother's life. He presented himself as reliable, a steady presence, and for a time, perhaps, Mary Ann allowed herself to believe she had found what she was looking for. However, the calm was deceptive. Tensions soon began to rise. London's control issues and increasingly aggressive behavior became apparent. Arguments between him and Mary Ann grew more frequent and intense. He resented her independence, her children, anything that detracted from his absolute dominion over her attention and life. The children, sensitive to the shifting atmosphere, became increasingly uncomfortable around him. What began as a hopeful new relationship slowly spiraled into a claustrophobic nightmare. Marion trapped in her own home with a man whose true nature was slowly revealing itself. The night of June 21st, 1999, was the beginning of the end. The exact sequence of events remains shrouded in London's calculated silence, a chilling testament to his control. What is known is that an argument escalated between Peter and Mary Ann. London's rage, long suppressed, finally exploded. He subjected Mary Ann to a horrific and prolonged assault, beating her to death in a fit of savage brutality. The screams that night, if any escaped the confines of the house, were lost to the suburban quiet, masked by the gentle hum of summer nights. Having murdered Mary Ann, London then turned his attention to her two sons, Dennis and Brian. The boys, who had likely witnessed parts of the attack on their mother or were aware of the escalating violence, were now in unimaginable peril. London, driven by a cold, methodical desire to eliminate all witnesses and loose ends, brutally murdered both children. Their deaths were as senseless and tragic as their mothers, erasing a family, leaving an empty void in the community. But the horror did not end with their deaths. London's prior conviction in the U.S. for dismembering his mother's body offered a chilling preview of his next actions. He meticulously set about disposing of the bodies, employing an unnerving blend of planning and ruthlessness. He dismembered Mary Ann, Dennis, and Brian, using tools to cut their bodies into smaller, manageable pieces. He then mixed their remains with concrete, soil, and other debris, meticulously distributing them in various locations around the property, the garden, a shed, even burying some parts under the floorboards of the house. His objective was clear: to erase all traces, to ensure the family simply vanished, leaving no evidence behind. He cleaned the house thoroughly, removing bloodstains, rearranging furniture, attempting to scrub away the horrifying reality of what had transpired. Days turned into weeks. Friends and family members of Mary Ann Peterson grew increasingly concerned. It was uncharacteristic for her not to answer calls, not to be seen with her children. Initial attempts to reach her were met with vague excuses from London, who claimed Mary Ann and the children had gone on holiday, or that they were staying with relatives. His calm demeanor and seemingly plausible explanations initially allayed some fears, but as time wore on, the excuses wore thin. The family's absence became too pronounced, too unnatural. Mary Ann's mother, particularly distressed by the lack of contact, eventually contacted the police. On July 3rd, 1999, officers arrived at the house and nested. London, still residing there, appeared cooperative, though his answers remained evasive. The police, sensing something amiss, began a more thorough investigation. They noticed inconsistencies in London's story, a nervous edge beneath his composed exterior. Despite his efforts to conceal the truth, the macabre scene he had created began to reveal itself. Investigators, trained to spot the subtle signs of foul play, found minute details that didn't align with London's narrative. The garden, usually well tended, had recently disturbed soil in unusual places. The air inside the house, though cleaned, held a faint, almost imperceptible odor that professional eyes and noses quickly picked up. As the search intensified, the grim discovery began. A piece of human bone here, a fragment of flesh there, mixed with the soil and concrete. The horror slowly unfolded as the police uncovered the dismembered remains, confirming their worst fears. Marion Peterson and her 2 sons had been murdered, and Peter London was undeniably responsible. London was arrested. During interrogation, he maintained an eerie calm, denying everything, offering no remorse. He refused to reveal the full extent of his actions or the precise locations of all the remains. His silence was as chilling as his violence, a psychological fortress he built around his monstrous deeds. The investigation turned into a painstaking forensic nightmare, as police sifted through soil, dismantled parts of the house, and meticulously cataloged every macabre find. The scale of his attempt to erase the family was staggering, reflecting a deeply disturbed mind. The trial of Peter London captivated Denmark. The nation watched in horror and disbelief as the details of the triple murder were laid bare. London sat in court, often expressionless, sometimes even smirking. He confessed to parts of the murders, but refused to provide a full, coherent account, nor did he offer any explanation or remorse. His defense, if it could be called that, hinged on vague claims and contradictions, but the overwhelming physical evidence, the scattered remains, and the timeline of events painted an undeniable picture of his guilt. Psychiatric evaluations of London were conducted, attempting to pierce the veil of his sanity. Experts struggled to categorize him. He was diagnosed with a severe personality disorder, characterized by a lack of empathy, manipulative tendencies, and a propensity for violence. He was deemed psychopathic, a man devoid of conscience, for whom human life held little value. The psychiatrist concluded that he was not insane in the legal sense, but rather a cold, calculating killer. On August 10, 2000, Peter London was found guilty of the murders of Marion Peterson, Dennis Peterson, and Brian Peterson. He was sentenced to life imprisonment, the harshest penalty under Danish law. The verdict brought a measure of justice, but it could never bring back the lives he had so cruelly extinguished. London's conviction did not mark the end of his chilling saga. From prison, he continued to manipulate, seeking attention, even marrying and divorcing several times. He became a macabre celebrity, a focal point for morbid fascination and public outrage. Each new piece of news about him, a new relationship, a hunger strike, a transfer between prisons, served as a grim reminder of the darkness he embodied. He frequently sought parole or transfer to a less restrictive facility, appeals that were consistently denied, given the severity and depravity of his crimes. The case of Peter London remains a dark chapter in Danish criminal history. It exposed the chilling reality that pure evil can walk among us, masked by a smile and a veneer of normalcy. The murders of Marion Peterson and her 2 young sons served as a brutal reminder of the importance of vigilance, of looking beyond the surface, and of the enduring pain that such unspeakable acts inflict upon families and communities. For the victims, their memory endures, a tragic testament to lives cut short by the shadow of a man who cared for nothing but his own twisted desires. London, incarcerated, remains a symbol of the depths of human cruelty, forever confined, but never forgotten. Thank you so much for watching tonight's True Crime Stories. I hope you found it as captivating as I did. If you enjoyed the video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments below. Where are you watching from tonight? And how did you feel about the story? Remember to stay safe, get some rest, and I'll see you in the next video. Until then, take care and good night.